This is Make Planning Make Sense. I'm your host, Aaron Zimmerman, and I'm a director at Centro. Before we jump in, I just wanted to let you know that we're going to begin releasing episodes fortnightly, so the next episode after this will be out on the 5th of March. Looking ahead, we've got a great lineup of guests, and we're very excited about where the season is heading. But also, now that we've got the pod up and running, I do want a bit more of my personal life back. I'm really grateful that our audience has grown with us through season 1, and we're looking forward to extending the reach of our conversations even further here in season 2. To each and every listener, thank you. Our guest this week is James Mickelburgh, co-founder of Jensen Hunt. As town planning agent, part of our role is to make sense of a subjective and often open-ended policy context that's always changing. The conversation with James shows how policies regarding environmental sustainability are amongst the most open-ended, the effects that can have on decision-making, and where we find optimism about these issues. Please give the podcast a follow on your preferred platform, recommend us to your network, and continue the conversation on our media channels MS Podcast on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky. Here is our conversation with James Mickelburgh. James Mickelburgh, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks a lot. No, great to be here.
We always like to start off with a little bit about who you are and how you came to your role.
Yeah, well, I'm James Mickelburgh, the co-founder of Jensen Hunt Design, a firm of structural engineers based in London. We've been running the company for nearly 10 years now. I set out with an old pal of mine that we used to work together with back in our BDP days. Basically, because of certain times of life and having young families, we decided to start our own businesses up independently from each other. And then we brought those two businesses together to help each other with the workload that we were having. Now we have a team of 9 engineers based up the road in Wood Street and undertake a wide variety of projects with hopefully a really great working atmosphere, which is one of the reasons why we set up our own business so that the guys who work for us can have a good time.
And you work in engineering, like you say, but a lot in sustainability, embodied carbon, whole life carbon.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So the business is first and foremost a structural engineering consultancy, but I guess my passion ultimately is sustainability and environmental impact and how we or I can have as much of a positive impact on that as possible. So we have a couple of offshoots from the company. One's another company called VerityPath, which is developing some carbon tracking software. And also we do an awful lot of work with natural materials and looking at how buildings can minimize their environmental impact using either reused or natural materials, moving a bit beyond the bounds of structural engineering, looking at a whole building as a whole and how we might achieve that.
There's a lot of frustration in the sector at the moment that materials beyond reinforced concrete aren't explored as a normal course of business for a lot of things like just a block of flats or a resi-led mixed-use kind of development. Yeah. And it's an interesting thing to watch from my perspective because I come from a country where timber frame homes are very common. Yeah. And of course, there are all of the sort of darling examples of the Scandinavian countries or these random sort of trophy projects here, there, and elsewhere that are using either cross-laminated timber or some other kind of wood-derived product because of its sustainability, flexibility, durability, and in the cases of the more modern materials, quite low fire risk. But adoption in the UK has been very slow. And I think insurers kind of point to building regs, acknowledge that they could point to themselves a little bit, but it's not really them as the insurers. And clients are not sure because they just don't want to deal with another layer of complexity. Yeah. Where do you see the sticking point to be most severe in adoption, and probably with an acknowledgement it's a little bit of everything?
Yeah, it's really interesting how we can make something that should be really simple, like really difficult to achieve. I think you're absolutely right. There's so many examples of different materials, more suitable materials being used either in the UK or in different countries where it becomes normal and normalized, and actually even the whole supply chain just is set up to deal with that. That is probably one of the biggest barriers that we see. I think it's the supply chain supporting that material choice, but also, as you quite rightly say, there's bureaucratic kind of pinch points like insurance and building control to a certain extent. I think standards are great, and they ensure a sort of minimum requirement of quality, but what they can do is really tie you up and restrict then what you're able to do if you're moving in towards the sort of the boundaries of that. We are in a slightly depressing position where it can be things as simple as insurance that are the blockers to using a material that actually isn't even really that different. Timber is one of the oldest building materials going.
Yeah.
And there are numerous examples of it being used very successfully. And yet there's these kind of bureaucratic blockers, which I find the most frustrating. I can understand maybe why supply chains aren't set up yet. It's quite complicated. There's a lot of layers, but I think those two are the sort of the biggest ones for me.
For the sake of the discussion, if we grant the premise that the UK timber industry, which is a robust existing industry, was growing the type and quality of wood to make high quality CLT, cross-laminated timber, how do you see a market entrant actually putting in that initial startup investment? Is that something that is like wind power where you might need a little bit of public assistance to lower that risk? Or is it something where somebody says, I want to do it tomorrow, but I need building regs to be clearer on it? How do we get off of the vicious cycle?
If I was a timber frame company looking to set up today and I was looking at it maybe more than 2-story buildings or commercial buildings or anything at the moment where it's slightly more difficult to achieve that than what we would call the norm, I would definitely be looking to have some kind of assurance that the industry will accept it. Not from a design perspective, we know that's okay. Not from a supply chain perspective, we know for timber frame that's okay. It's a case of when you get to that point, almost at the end of the building's construction period, when you need to get certain types of sign-off and the legal bit comes into play, that's the bit I'd want insurances for. I'd want insurances that the people signing off understood what this material was and how suitable it was. And I'd want insurances that the insurance market could also deal with it too. And they knew what they were dealing with and they could handle the supposed risks associated with that material, and they had a robust system for dealing with that.
That makes sense, because without that, no one wants to put in that initial investment into manufacturing, which is equipment heavy. And then no developer is going to say, we're getting a planning team together, we're getting a design team together, I want this to be CLT, because they don't know that that choice is even possible to get them to where they need to go, which is completion of the building.
Yeah.
So call to action to the building regs community and the insurance industry. We've listened to content before and there's been discussions around this and everyone is saying it's not really us, but it's kind of them. So if anybody's in that sort of group of finger pointing, then they can probably skip that stage a little bit by being a leader in that.
Yeah, I think often these things, I like you break it down to simplistic things that are actually going on. And, you know, I've heard insurers talk about the level of risk associated with certain types of materials. But when you listen to what they're actually saying, I get that it might make sense from an insurer's perspective, but it doesn't make sense from anybody listening to that, because they talk about a lack of data and a lack of understanding how that building might perform in catastrophic scenarios like a fire or building collapse or whatever. They're talking about how to put a value on how much of that building might be there when those situations happen against materials such as concrete or steel, for example. But I find that quite a lame argument, again, because we're talking about materials that's hardly innovative. And also, there are so many examples of steel buildings, concrete buildings behaving very badly in those sorts of situations. And so therefore, to make the excuse they don't have the data, it doesn't really stand up for me. They're using that as a way of putting risk onto those decisions when really they should be supporting it. When I hear that example, I just get really frustrated.
I just picture them looking down at like the desk in front of them being like, oh, there's no data here.
Yeah. It's like, let's just slap a load of risk on that.
But also so many insurers are multinational and are either operating in or headquartered in places where CLT is a common building material. Yeah, got the data, but also just take a bit of a comparative perspective. Just look off the island. You know, if you're an international insurer and see a problem with that, let us know. But like, why wouldn't you just say, all right, look, building safety regulator, look, building regs people, this is an example from Sweden, this is an example from Italy.
Yeah.
Fire is fire. So are we good? Right?
Yeah. And I don't want to sort of get into a whole philosophical debate. Let's do it. But, you know, when I heard the insurer making these comments, it wasn't that long after Grenfell. But Grenfell was a reinforced concrete building, I think, that had been clad over the top and reclad. And the problem with it wasn't even the initial material. It was the way it had been modified over the years. And the system wasn't robust enough really to understand it. That we're talking about material that industry knows is perfectly acceptable in that sort of situation against a building that, according to the insurer, is absolutely fine. And yet there was a very well-known, prominent case where it wasn't. It just felt to me that, like, at the time that the person was making those comments, it just really didn't stack up in terms of it, you know, applying it to a material as well known as timber.
I wonder if there is a little bit of just nervousness from a business operations perspective that nobody wants to be the first person. And then, of course, when the option is either to be the first person or to look for a reason that you're not going to be the first person, even though it's the morally right thing to do, you run into that. Unfortunately, this won't be possible. It won't be possible, unfortunately. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah. It's a really interesting balance, isn't it? Because you hear lots of organisations talking about wanting to be the first. We were the first office building to do this, or we were the first building in central London to do this. And a lot of that outward messaging, behind that, it's not quite as progressive as those organisations or the people making those claims are actually doing.
Yeah.
And I think when I have heard people, clients especially, who have been in that situation and have pushed the boundaries, who genuinely were the first to do a central London office building in a timber frame, those stories are really interesting because they really did do that. And they actually did push through all those boundaries and all those barriers. You've got multiple stakeholders trying to achieve something a little bit different from the norm. So it goes back to that thing of aligning your visions, getting everyone together. You know where those barriers are going to be early on, and you try and get those people involved right at the beginning so that it doesn't become a problem later on. Where I've heard it being successful, that's the way it's been done.
From the planning perspective, from day one, there are certain sort of assumptions that could be talked about that aren't necessarily the first round of pre-app drawings that we have an opportunity to review, for example, are built in a way that presumes a concrete frame.
Yeah.
I know everybody wants to be the person in the industry who gets to be thought of day one. Everybody wants to be on day one. What would your case be for sustainability and construction materials to be the first things to be thought of?
Yeah, this is really interesting for me because I think often where we come into projects, it's a lot further down the line than we'd like. But also it's interesting for me to just see how further back in time, if you like, compared to where we get involved, the start actually is. I don't think we even sometimes know where that is. And you guys, what I find really interesting about planning is that it is much further back in terms of where that start point actually is. It's really interesting the conversations we've had about how influential planning consultants can be in shaping not only what the building ends up being, but whether it's additional stories, whether it's a basement, whether it's cut and carve, or whatever might be the appropriate thing. At that point, as soon as those conversations are happening, that's when it needs to be thought about. And we talk a lot about the first thing people need to talk about is setting that environmental criteria, that agenda right at the very beginning.
Yeah.
And setting that as the very first thing, and then seeing how that plays out against even planning policy, that early stage input.
The public engagement people think it should be public engagement. So do you have a response to that?
Let the public decide.
Yeah, exactly. We've got a PR agent in the room coming in. And I guess when we're talking about sustainability in day one, it's not only materials, it's the built form. It's whether you excavate a basement, it's whether you reuse portions of the existing building or all of the existing building in that development.
Yeah, and also it's how does that building help that local area be more sustainable? How does it help the people in that area live a more sustainable life? How does it give them things that they might not have if that building wasn't there? And I think it can get very complex. But I think sustainability has many strands. So it's being really clear at the beginning of that project what it is in that area you're trying to achieve. And then I guess the complexity is how does that then align with policy and taking it through the sort of process from there onwards.
Exactly. These are the questions that we need to wrestle with when we're writing that planning statement.
Yeah.
And we're saying, look, it's a public benefit regarding environmental sustainability because of this material, because of this proportion of retention of existing fabric, this proportion of recycling for waste materials. But I like this idea of a public benefit regarding environmental sustainability for the effects of that building coming forward for the neighborhood. So I imagine it would be something like if you're proposing a small greengrocer in a neighborhood that doesn't have one in walking distance, you're contributing to the 15-minute city sustainability principles and therefore disincentivizing car use for small grocery runs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Damn.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
And I think that's it, isn't it? Because so much of it isn't just necessarily about the building itself. It's about, especially if you're looking at master planning or really large multi-use sites, it's more than just the building. It's more than just the materials. It's about how the people are going to use this, what else needs to be in that master plan to enable that kind of micro society to be able to live in that way. And that will then give you information on what other types of services, buildings, whatever you might need on that site.
It's really remarkable in a way that we're talking about things like embodied carbon and percentage of recycling when maybe 20 years ago, it was a bit niche to be like mixed use, guys. Mixed use is better. Yeah. Activate the public space at more times of day with more types of people and more types of uses. And now that's just such a given. And we're talking about something that just seems much more technical and much more minute. Where do you see sustainability heading? We want net zero. We can't build to net zero now. Is there like an AI singularity horizon for net zero? When are we getting there?
Yeah. I mean, it's hugely complex. And like, I think we can make it really, really complicated. I think we do make it really complicated.
Thank you.
I always think that we've actually solved a lot of these problems already. If you look at the way society, or certainly the construction industry it's just a sort of microcosm of society's development, certainly since the Industrial Revolution. And I do all this when I'm thinking about materiality, when I'm thinking about circularity, low carbon materials, when I'm thinking about the effect of the local area on that development. I think about look what it was like pre-Industrial Revolution, when actually everything was circular, materials were natural, buildings created local jobs for local people, things were made locally. You didn't have big transportation distances because you couldn't do it. We have solved a lot of these problems already. We just don't realise that we have. And certainly in terms of sort of social value, you don't have to go too far back where you see large parts of cities being developed for certain companies because they knew the workers needed to be there, so they built them homes, they built them streets, they built them good quality places to live. We have done a lot of this already before. Mm-hmm. We just call it different things now and overcomplicate it. It's like a double-edged sword. Part of it's really complicated because we make it complicated, and therefore we've got to try and solve that. But part of it, we've done it before, and we've got to keep remembering to look back. And I think if we do that, we'll see some clearer pathways of how to achieve it. I think if we don't, we'll keep going down a pathway where we just keep overcomplicating stuff. Because if you look at the landscape now, heading to net zero, it's almost probably impossible. The way, and this is where I always...
You heard it here first.
You heard it here first. Like, it's not going to happen. But I think if we look at it if we navel gaze too much, it's definitely not going to happen. We've got to look at bigger level systems change. And that's what I mean about looking at examples where, look, we've done it before. There are things that we can learn from the past that we need to start looking at now and look at how we reconstruct stuff in order to make it at a higher level to make some of these things more achievable.
And I think that strikes at any kind of system level reform, any kind of paradigm shift. You're taking it beyond, we need to get to net zero, and it's no reasonable person would disagree with that.
Yeah.
How do we do it?
Yeah.
What are the changes in incentives, in decision-making structures, and regulation, and market forces to actually get us at least closer? You know, if we're still planting 10 trees for a block of flats, and that's what actually gets us over to net zero, great. Who cares?
Yeah.
It's perfect.
Yeah.
The construction industry will, for probably our lifetimes, still have carbon positive effects, i.e. negative environmental effects, right?
Yeah.
Where do you see offsetting fitting into net zero in the built environment sector?
I'd always put it as the very lowest in a hierarchy of options. Probably put it as the one at the bottom.
It's like buying an indulgence, right? I'll just buy a bunch of trees and then it's back to zero.
Then I'm okay. Then I've offset. I'm okay. I guess we want to get to a point where we're not emitting. Ultimately, let's just take buildings as an example, because as an industry, it's an extremely high emitter. It will be extremely difficult to get to net zero. I think we need to be honest about that. If you can't get to net zero, you need to know what your remaining emissions are. Then you need to look at your options. Now, obviously, taking embodied carbon as an example, there will be, I think, in any building some residual levels of embodied carbon. And then you have to look outside the construction industry to how you're going to reduce those. So, if the grid decarbonizes, so, your transportation, your production of those materials and are net zero, great. Then we're going to get a lot closer. And you're probably going to have, after doing everything, circularity, reuse, decarbonize the grid, you're going to have an element left. And maybe that last element then needs to be offset, possibly. And I always think it should be the last resort, because I think we need to look at the mechanisms in the current systems where we actually can have biggest impact in terms of actually reducing emissions.
Yeah.
But there may be a residual element that the only way that we can do something about is by offsetting. And if that's done in a positive way, doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing. It just needs to be looked at as not an easy win.
A quick bit of admin over the break. Listeners might remember way back in season 1 that we promised you an Ask Me Anything Q&A episode once we reached 150 followers on Spotify. I confess we actually passed that goal a few weeks ago, and we want to stay true to our word and make an episode answering your questions. There's just one thing. Y'all are going to need to send us some questions. If you're not keen, no worries, but if we do receive enough questions to make a little episode out of it, we'd be delighted. You can send questions on our socials, MPMS Podcast on Instagram, X, or Blue Sky, or email your questions to podcast@centroplan.co.uk. We look forward to hearing from you. Now, back to the conversation with James. Jensen Hunt has done some work for local authorities as well, right?
Yeah.
Including the London Borough of Camden.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your work with Camden?
Yeah. Essentially, we were involved through Etude Sustainability Consultants in helping them put together a study for a part of the planning policy that was related to basements and the embodied carbon of basements, partly because there was a bit of a gap in the planning policy related to pretty embodied carbon heavy part of construction. And essentially, it was looking at how to deal with if a basement does get planning, if it gets through the process and therefore it's deemed acceptable, how do you then deal with the embodied carbon aspect of that? And it was essentially looking at what could you do with a building if you had a lot of carbon in one bit of it, how would that then affect what you might be able to do the rest of the building? So it's almost like a sort of a little internal offset thing where we know that we've put a lot down here, maybe then you might not be able to get planning for certain other bits if you spent it all down there in terms of where the carbon goes, if that makes sense. We basically ran a whole load of different studies on different forms of basements construction just to get an idea of the levels of embodied carbon for different types of basements, and then to try and set some benchmarks basically to look at what they were in the first instance, so we knew what figures we're dealing with in terms of embodied carbon, and then how that might affect what you might then be able to do in terms of certainly how might that compare, say, to a loft conversion or a back extension or something like that, to get some sort of metrics against that.
So is the idea that certain methods of construction or certain types of excavation might be lower carbon, and so there might be a preference at the local authority for different types of basements even?
Yeah, that's right. And it was just to undertake that study, so we had some information to try and guide us to what the answers were, and also to how that fits into the existing policy for granting basements for Camden, especially with their kind of 5-step process, their screening process, and how that fits in with that, because obviously there's a lot of other variables to take into account. So it was really looking at that, and it was really interesting for us because we do want to try and shape policy, but at the same time it is interesting just how complicated it is when you're looking at one specific thing and then how it fits into the rest of the policy, which is complicated.
It's absolutely complicated, and I think it's really sometimes difficult to put that onus on a planning officer to say, you've got these expectations around plant, the ability to connect in the future to a district heating network, i.e. you're going to need a little bit of a basement. You want the cycle parking, you want the active frontage, you want the bins, you want the services to be out of the way, And on some sites, depending on the quantum of development, etc., all of those things that I listed just start indicating toward basement.
Yeah.
It sounds like the work that you were doing was saying, okay, where there has been a decision that a basement is okay here because it delivers other things that we want in these competing and sort of spatial zero-sum objectives. What can we do above ground?
Yeah.
What can we do through the development of the basement and then also above ground to just keep it?
Yeah, that's exactly it. It wasn't a way of saying you can't have basements. There was a way of information gathering, really, to look at what is the impact of basements in terms of embodied carbon.
Yeah.
And therefore, what then might we do with that in terms of policy to deal with it effectively? But you're quite right. When you're looking at that in isolation, that's one thing. But when you're looking at it against all those other factors, you might find that a basement is the best option. And it might even be the best option from a buildability perspective, or it might be the best option from an environmental perspective, because I think it's important to understand that, like we were saying earlier about materiality, some materials are still the best material for a use in a certain situation. It doesn't mean we shouldn't use them. It should mean that we make decisions based on information and understanding what the best course of action is. So it was really a case of trying to get to that point.
Being able to pause and think, I'm at a decision point.
Yeah.
Am I going to take the step toward a carbon heavy option because I haven't taken a pause, or because that is the best option for this development?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that'll make sense to me. I'm keen to talk about a particular climate policy that I think shows the good intentions whilst also demonstrating that planning actually might not be the leading part of the sector for this issue, for it to get to where we need it to be.
Yeah.
But on this particular issue, let us turn our textbooks to
yes, this example
to my absolute favorite climate policy. So we're going to talk through policy CC1 in the Camden local plan. So if we look at the intentions that Camden has for carbon, Camden's local plan says that the authority will promote zero carbon development. That sounds good. Require all major developments to demonstrate how London plan targets for carbon dioxide emissions have been met. Makes sense, right? Policy SI2, very comfortable. And then I'm going to skip down a little bit. So we're going to focus in on E and F, which are the subparagraphs of the policy. They're going to require all proposals that involve substantial demolition to demonstrate that it's not possible to retain and improve the existing building. and they're going to expect all developments to optimize resource efficiency. What it could possibly mean to optimize resource efficiency relative to all of the other objectives of planning, I don't know. But the idea that substantial demolition can only be justified where it's been demonstrated that it is not possible to retain and improve the existing building, I think is, at face value, at plain reading, a really oddly high bar.
Yeah.
So, question mark?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it goes on to say the details of this sort of process are going to be sorted out in some guidance.
Yeah.
After the examination, public and the inspector.
Yeah.
Let's us have this. So then Camden has some planning guidance, which sort of explains the hierarchy of preferences. And if you demonstrate that the first three are not possible, then you can reclaim and recycle, as in just demolish the existing building.
Yeah.
But let's go through what you have to demonstrate before you're allowed to demolish and rebuild. So the first option is just retaining the building as it is, minor works, and continued occupation. Okay, well, we can't do that. Significantly improve the service life of the existing building, including the opportunity to retrofit. And then the third option is similar to the above, but it takes into the need to optimize the site capacity. This might involve substantial changes, but you should still retain as much as you can in that optimization process. And where it can be demonstrated to the council's satisfaction that none of those three is possible, then you're allowed to demolish it. And when you look at this, you just think any building could meet those three requirements. What do we do in a fairly low density typology on average across Camden, where the housing delivery targets aren't being met and where they can't demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply?
Yeah, I think this is a really good example of just how complex trying to weave something like this into a planning policy is. Because I guess if you take a step back, why are they saying this in the first place? Basically, I think planning policy should do this. They need to be saying that, look, we've got a load of existing building stock here. Let's have a look at what we've got first before we just rush to demolish stuff and rebuild it, especially when you think of the environmental impact of doing that time and time again. So I understand why planning policies need to have something in them that sort of says, look, we need a set of processes here to go through to say, like, is this building actually fit for purpose? And what do you actually need to do? What do you need to do to check for that? How do you check for that? What are the processes? And then once you've done that, how do you start making decisions about where to go from there? I get why they're doing what they're doing.
Totally agree. Right. Everything you said so far, yep, totally get it.
Yeah.
Right. That all makes sense. It was what we were just discussing a couple minutes ago.
Yeah.
Super on board with that. It's an important thing to think about. You have to stop at the crossroads and think, hold on, what are my options? What's the best option for the site and for the environment?
Yeah. The complexity comes into actually trying to do that and all the different, I guess, factors and variables that go into trying to make that decision, because it comes back to information and data and like accessing that example, that building, whatever it is, for how efficient is it in its current state? How adaptable is it to changing? How do you even work out is it better to demolish and rebuild it? Or is it better to keep it, adapt it, and reuse it? Yeah. So what we find when we're trying to create policy that affects positive change is it's easy to talk about it, certainly on a high level, but when you get into the detail of it, it's really difficult to actually achieve these things. And especially when you're trying to do something in planning policy, what you want to do is compare apples with apples, but probably a lot of the time, the way it's done means that, a lot of what you're looking at is variable in terms of quality.
Mind you, I have no intention of dragging Camden's policymaking team through the public square or anything like that. That's absolutely not the idea. It's just, I think, a really good example of that sort of suggestion earlier that planning might not be the leader on this issue, because what the policy says to me is good intentions, at face value, kind of unintended complications relative to things like economic and social sustainability, especially in a borough that doesn't really have any land that isn't protected or previously developed. I think it's difficult.
It's difficult. I think we've touched on this before as well, is that there's a lot of juicy things in here, but it might not always be leading you to the right decision at the end, especially when you're thinking about some other factors outside of the bounds of decarbonisation, material circularity, retrofit first. These are all great things. We want to make sure that these policies are leading us to the right decisions overall and not just getting too focused on one or two specific things.
Yeah. It's a little bit classic in planning that all of the onus is put onto the applicant to demonstrate that everything's acceptable, but we can put out all the evidence that we can. And I feel like still the answer doesn't come from the data in this kind of question. And so it kind of makes me wonder whether the policy making team knows where they want to end up. Doesn't exactly know beyond a few sort of hierarchical kind of preferences where they want to go to end up. And then just kind of saying, you figure it out.
Yeah. And it's almost like we've got this sort of process. Planning happens really early on. You're not going to go too far with something until you've got planning. There's a lot of risk associated with the process. But a lot of the policy is almost written in the sense that it's almost like you need to get to the end of the design process before you, or even possibly even construction or in use before you can actually demonstrate some of this stuff.
Yeah.
So like, I totally agree. The policy is almost set in a way that maybe isn't achievable with the current process, and possibly these markers of saying we want to get planning at a certain design stage because we don't want to go too far and risk too much at that point. You're only going to have a certain amount of information at that point. So you might not even be able to answer some of these things. And then you get into, well, what are we doing? Are we conditioning all this off, or how are we dealing with that leftover bit of information that's only going to come later? And I think even if you look at the upcoming UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard that's looking to track carbon emissions through design, construction, and then in use, 12 months of occupancy, that's going to be linked to planning. And that's going to, at some point, you're going to have to then condition it out until that point there. How does that work in terms of having a policy that's started right at the beginning? But now we're talking about you're not going to start being able to answer some of those questions in 12 months into using that building. And that is going to be really difficult to achieve. I totally agree with it, certainly from a carbon certification perspective. But I think these kind of markers for planning is possibly not quite fit for purpose for something that's going to be drawn out for that length of time.
It just makes me think, I'd love to answer that question for you if we could.
Yeah.
But it's a little bit Spanish Inquisition, like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin and don't get the wrong answer because you're in trouble?
Yeah.
I don't know. Have we optimized it relative to carbon? There's no combustion on site?
Yeah.
That's good.
Great.
Triple glazing? We get down? No, not necessarily. There's a lot more.
Yeah.
And again, it's just something that is part of, I think, a larger policy making discussion. Not Camden being foolish or Camden being cavalier. I just think that it's a good illustration of policies that ask for the best, and I don't think that the policy maker or the decision maker knows exactly what best means for that issue.
Yeah, what they're trying to really get to with that.
And that's a lot to ask because, if it's optimization of height, massing, unit mix, affordability, carbon impact, a lot of policies are sort of about optimization, and you sort of have to be that philosopher king for each policy. We know enough to be dangerous in all of the issues. Yeah. So it's really helpful to talk with an actual subject matter expert and be like, can we figure this out?
Yeah, because each one of those examples, you need to be an expert in each one of those fields to kind of achieve all of those things. And yet, from a planning officer perspective, like you said, you've got to try and understand all of that and make a decision. Yeah. One of the things I keep coming back to is that we're in a really embryonic part of the industry for this, especially in terms of routes to net zero. Trying to fit all this into policy that makes everybody happy is we're in a really early, and we don't actually have a lot of information on what success is at the end of that process yet, because we haven't done it enough times. We probably haven't even done it yet to know that, okay, look, this is what we mean, this is what we're trying to achieve, and actually this is what we try and do with the carbon tracking platform, is actually learn from stuff that's been done to set benchmarks for the next stuff. And actually, I think possibly that's where planning policy might need to go. Identify what successful is, and then use that to start setting some benchmarks for some of the policies, so that you don't always then necessarily have to have all the information up front, and either draw out that process of trying to hit those milestones and dealing with that issue of what do we do up until we've got planning, what do we do afterwards, but actually use existing information, or once we've identified what it is, to feed that back into the beginning of the process to help maybe benchmark some of those policies.
Build the database, gather the information so you can start to index what exactly a right range of options would look like. And then start to create actual sort of acceptable and unacceptable boundaries within.
I think so.
Within the field.
Yeah.
God, we're good.
We solved it. We solved all of the industry's problems.
What you were saying just there, though, also reminded me of something you were saying earlier, which is how important it is to also pause and look behind us and realize how far we've come from heating oil being dead common in my childhood to individual gas boilers being common when I was already working in planning to now zero combustion buildings being the unchallenged standard. I think that's actually quite powerful. So we're going there even though we can't seem very, very far ahead of us, I think. But we are making progress, and I think that's good to hold on to.
I think we are. And I think there's certain things that I do see it achievable. Zero operational buildings, I think, is achievable. And I think almost Yeah, that goes hand in hand with sort of zero bills. Buildings that effectively don't cost you anything to run from an operations perspective, an energy operations perspective, is achievable. So we are doing good in some areas. And some of that, I think, happens outside the bounds of policy and standards because it's just the industry's just going that direction. People are making decisions based on a lot of that might be cost-driven decisions, and actually it's proving to be a good thing. So we're definitely making progress. I think we still need to strip back what it is that ultimately the really high level stuff, not lose sight of what we're really trying to achieve, a society that benefits future generations in all aspects where damage is done. I think that's the bit we've got to remember. And I think we still need to look at what it was like before it was a problem. I think it's really important to look at the linkages between the Industrial Revolution, mass production materials, obsession with GDP, and how that's driven societal decisions.
Yeah.
Because we're not looking at you only need to go back sort of 60, 70 years to look at a time where it wasn't quite as linked as it is now. It's not that far back. And I think undoing some of those forks in the road where those decisions were made, we must relook at those and think about it. How did we get to where we got to? I guess it's rather the tail wagging the dog, but we don't want to keep putting sticky plasters and stuff. We actually want to deal with the cause.
I think that's right. For example, I don't think that a post-completion report to confirm that an average user will use no more than 105 liters of water per day is anything more than an ad hoc thing to something that's already arrived. I've never seen like a shower head that isn't low flow in a building that isn't from like the 70s. Like I can't even picture one. And then sometimes I take a bath and run the dishwasher and I'm like, oops, I exceeded my 105 liters today. Too much. But there are things that are just, to your point, already rolling along that maybe we don't need to test with a pre-submission water use survey and then a post-completion report. Yeah. Maybe that's a little bit ad hoc at that point.
I had a really great discussion with Annalie Richards from McCall Richards Architects at London Build Expo. We were talking building places that benefit the people and the planet. Yeah. And they've done a lot of work on post-occupancy data, and they do a lot of work for social housing designs and striving to achieve sustainable, low-impact designs where people can genuinely improve their lives by living in them. They actually don't cost anything to run those buildings. They can do things they wouldn't have been able to do before because it might mean they don't need to queue up at a food bank because they've got a bit more money because the building was cheaper to run than before. And that linking the sort of environmental impact adds with that improvement in living standards, I think is really interesting. And they work a lot with post-occupancy data to help them understand how it's actually helping the people that then occupy and use those buildings. The data that they're getting from that will be really important, not only in terms of thinking about how we do that more successfully in the future, but how we use it to shape policy in the right way to help use that. That's success. In those sorts of projects, to me, how do we get that into policy that's then easy to follow, easy to use, easy to help people make the right decisions at that point so they can get to that. That's what we're trying to achieve. Easier said than done, but it's great to talk to people who are in that space and really achieving some of those things at that level.
That is terrific. I think that's really admirable as well because it shows the ways that when you make space in carbon, you can use that space for something else, right? And it could be helping a family save on their energy and hot water bill, right?
Yeah.
But, all of the things.
Yeah, we all need good news stories, right? Everyone needs a bit of hope, but also I think philosophically, success stories do drive people on to keep going. It's easy to do some doom mongering, bash ourselves too much. When you get it right, you realise what the benefits are. It's not just a soundbite for a bit of brand messages. This stuff generally helps people if you get it right. And I think we do need to hear the success stories because that's what keeps us driving, moving on and trying to get, if we can feed that back into policy more easily, grease the wheels for better decisions. But we need to know what good is, don't we? We need to know what those really good success stories are so we can feed that back into the beginning of the process.
Absolutely. This might be one for the listeners. Share success stories.
Share success stories.
Yeah. I love that. That's probably a good place to end. James Mickelburgh of Jensen Hunt, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Make Planning Make Sense. Please do give the show a follow and please share the show to keep the conversation going and the community growing. Find us on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky at MPMS Podcast or write to us at podcast@centroplan.co.uk. Make Planning Make Sense is presented by Centro Planning Consultancy and recorded in beautiful London, England. Its executive producer is me, Aaron Zimmerman. Marketing and promotion by our colleague Reese Raymond. Graphic design by our colleague Mariam Malaxi. Music by Joseph McDade. From all of us here at Centro, thanks again for listening.